Welcome back, spiritual wanderers. Tonight, we're standing beneath the towering Buddha of Bamian, where 55 meters of carved stone watches over pilgrims from across the ancient world. Not the familiar tale of Buddhism spreading along trade routes, but the hidden truth beneath that sacred valley, that faith becomes universal only when it learns to speak every language. Just a story of morning prayers, distant journeys, and sacred fires, and the realization that the divine reveals itself through every sincere heart that seeks it. If you find peace in these stories of ancient faiths crossing impossible boundaries, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Drop a comment about which spiritual tradition most shaped our world. There's something profound about knowing we're all walking paths first carved by pilgrims who saw no borders between souls. So dim the lights. Let's begin with dawn breaking over Bamian, where 1,000 monks from distant lands gather in prayer, and where every whispered sutra carries the hopes of civilizations learning to find God in foreign tongues. Chapter 7. Religious and Spiritual Exchanges. In the hour before dawn, when the first pale light touches the towering face of the cliff at Bamian, the great Buddha carved into living rock seems to breathe with the awakening day. 55 meters of stone shaped into divine form, weathered by centuries of wind and sun, yet radiating the serene compassion that has drawn pilgrims across impossible distances. The colossal figure watches over a valley that has become one of the holiest places in the Buddhist world. Below its gentle gaze, the monastery courtyard fills with the soft rustle of movement as over 1,000 monks from across Asia gather for morning prayers. Among them stands Xuanzang, the Chinese pilgrim whose 16-year journey in search of Buddhist wisdom has brought him through desert wastes and mountain passes to this sacred valley in the heart of what would one day be called Afghanistan. His travel-worn robes, patched with fabric from a dozen different kingdoms, mark him as one who has walked the great roads that connect the civilized world. Yet this morning, as he raises his eyes to the towering Buddha whose gold leaf still glitters in places where the morning sun strikes carved stone, he experiences something that no amount of travel could have prepared him for. The monks surrounding him represent the entire scope of the Buddhist world. Saffron robes from the monasteries of India flutter beside the dark brown wool of Tibetan practitioners who have crossed the high passes of the Himalayas. Chinese monks in gray silk stand shoulder to shoulder with Central Asian Sogdians, whose monasteries serve the merchant caravans that carry both goods and wisdom along the ancient routes. Korean pilgrims who have journeyed thousands of miles to walk in the footsteps of the Buddha share this sacred space with local Bactrian monks whose families have tended these shrines for generations. The sound of their combined prayers rises like incense in the crystalline mountain air. Sanskrit syllables learned in the monasteries of Nalanda, blending with Chinese intonations adapted to Buddhist concepts. Sogdian translations that preserve the meaning while serving the practical needs of international commerce, and local Bactrian words that carry the flavor of ancient traditions transformed by encounter with the Dharma. This symphony of devotion speaks to something unprecedented in human history, a religion that has learned to cross every boundary of language, culture, and custom, while maintaining the essential unity of its spiritual message. Xuanzang's scholar's eye notes the extraordinary fusion of artistic traditions that surrounds him. The Buddha statue itself represents the Gandharan synthesis that has transformed Buddhist art throughout Central Asia, its facial features reflecting the Greek sculptural tradition brought by Alexander's armies, its spiritual expression drawing from Indian contemplative traditions, its massive scale adapted to the Persian architectural vision that seeks to overwhelm the human observer with divine magnitude. The caves that honeycomb the cliff face around the great figure contain frescoes, where Chinese landscape techniques frame Indian religious narratives, where Persian decorative patterns provide backgrounds for Buddhist philosophical concepts, where local artistic traditions contribute their own understanding of how divine truth can be made visible to human eyes. As the morning prayers conclude and the international gathering begins to disperse for the day's activities, Xuanzang realizes that he has witnessed something that extends far beyond religious observance. In this valley where traders rest, their caravans, and pilgrims renew their spiritual strength, where scholars from distant universities gather to debate philosophical questions, and craftsmen from various traditions collaborate in creating objects of beauty and devotion, the ancient dream of human unity has found concrete expression. The Silk Road has become more than a network of commercial routes. It has evolved into humanity's first experiment in creating genuine international community based on shared spiritual vision rather than political conquest. The incense that burns in bronze braziers throughout the monastery complex carries scents that tell their own story of connection across vast distances. Sandalwood from the forests of India mingles with juniper gathered from the mountains that surround this valley. Frankincense that has traveled from the shores of Arabia blends with camphor from the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, while the subtle fragrance of Chinese aloes wood speaks of devotion that has crossed the breadth of the known world. Each aromatic offering represents not merely the material substance itself, but the faith of communities separated by months of difficult travel, yet united in their recognition that some truths transcend all boundaries. The monastery's library, where Xuanzang will spend precious weeks copying texts that exist nowhere else in the world, contains palm leaf manuscripts from Ceylon, written in scripts that preserve the Buddha's teachings in their oldest recorded forms. Chinese translations that demonstrate how Buddhist concepts have been adapted to Confucian and Taoist ways of thinking. Sanskrit commentaries produced by Indian scholars who have spent lifetimes in contemplation of philosophical subtleties, and new compositions created right here in this international center by monks who speak multiple languages and understand how the same spiritual insight can be expressed through different cultural frameworks. As Xuanzang settles into his temporary cell, its window offering a view of the great Buddha's face partially illuminated by the rising sun, he understands that his journey has brought him to more than a destination. Bamian represents the culmination of a process that began centuries earlier, when the first Buddhist merchants carried their faith along with their trade goods, when the first monasteries were established to serve the spiritual needs of travelers far from home, when the first translations were attempted by scholars who believed that wisdom belonged to all humanity rather than to any single people. In this valley where cultures meet and traditions blend without losing their essential character, the true spirit of the Silk Road reveals itself as something far more profound than commercial exchange, a testament to humanity's ancient recognition that the most precious goods are those that can be shared without diminishment, that the greatest treasures are those that grow more valuable the more widely they are distributed. The sacred journeys begin. Long before Xuanzang stood beneath the great Buddha at Bamian, feeling the weight of centuries in the carved stone face that gazed serenely across the valley, other pilgrims and merchants had already begun shaping the spiritual roads that would transform how humanity understood the sacred. In the bustling bazaars of Bactria and Sogdiana, where the scent of cardamom mingles with the dust raised by camel caravans and the sound of haggling echoes in a dozen different languages, Buddhist traders from the kingdoms beyond the Hindu Kush began the patient work of carrying their faith into the heart of Central Asia. These early Buddhist merchants represented something unprecedented in the ancient world: adherents of a religion that actively sought to transcend the boundaries of ethnicity, language, and cultural tradition. Unlike the faith systems that had previously dominated the ancient world, where religious participation typically coincided with tribal membership and gods were seen as the exclusive property of particular peoples, Buddhism proclaimed a message that it considered universally applicable to human suffering and spiritual development. The Four Noble Truths that the Buddha had articulated under the Bodhi tree in distant India, the recognition that earthly existence involves suffering, but that this suffering could be transcended through proper understanding and ethical conduct, offered hope that required no particular ancestry or cultural preparation. The Kushan Empire, which emerged from the complex political upheavals following Alexander's conquests, provided the political framework that enabled this spiritual revolution to unfold. King Kanishka, whose reign in the early 2nd century CE marked the height of Kushan power, made a decision that would transform Central Asia's spiritual landscape for centuries. Rather than imposing any single faith tradition, he chose to patronize Buddhism as a unifying force that could provide spiritual coherence without threatening cultural identity. The coins from his reign tell this story beautifully. Images of the Buddha appearing alongside Greek deities and Iranian symbols, creating a visual language that honored multiple traditions while promoting Buddhist values as a common ethical framework. In workshops attached to major monasteries, where oil lamps flickered late into the night over Sanskrit manuscripts, sculptors whose training spanned multiple artistic traditions created Buddha images that spoke to diverse cultural audiences. These Gandharan sculptures achieved something beyond mere artistic fusion. They created visual forms that enabled people from different backgrounds to recognize the same spiritual reality, while approaching it through their own aesthetic heritage. The economic foundation that supported these religious developments demonstrates how commercial prosperity and spiritual growth could reinforce each other in positive cycles. Buddhist merchants who established trading relationships throughout Central Asia often endowed monasteries in the cities where they conducted regular business, creating institutions that served both their own spiritual needs and those of the local populations who encountered Buddhism through these merchant communities. The monasteries, in turn, provided valuable services to the commercial networks that funded them: secure accommodation for traveling traders, banking services that enabled the transfer of funds across vast distances, and educational facilities that produced the linguistically skilled personnel necessary for international commerce. The translation movement that began during this period represents one of humanity's earliest systematic attempts to make religious and philosophical texts accessible across linguistic boundaries. The scholars who undertook this demanding work, often monks who had spent years mastering multiple languages and religious traditions, faced challenges that went far beyond simple linguistic conversion. Buddhist technical terms for meditative states and philosophical concepts often had no equivalent in the target languages, requiring translators to create new vocabulary or adapt existing terms in ways that preserved essential meanings while making them comprehensible to new audiences. The Lotus Sutra, one of the most influential texts in Mahayana Buddhism, provides an excellent example of how this translation process could transform both the text and the receiving culture. When rendered into Central Asian languages, the sutra's emphasis on the universal potential for Buddhahood resonated with local shamanic traditions that recognized the possibility of spiritual transformation through proper practice. While its sophisticated philosophical discussions of reality and appearance appealed to communities influenced by Greek philosophical thinking, the text thus became a bridge between different ways of understanding the relationship between the material and spiritual dimensions of existence. The missionary activities that accompanied these commercial and scholarly exchanges demonstrate how Buddhism adapted its evangelistic methods to the cultural requirements of different populations. Unlike some later religious movements that would demand the complete abandonment of previous traditions, early Buddhist missionaries typically sought to identify elements within existing belief systems that could serve as foundations for Buddhist understanding. Local deities were often reinterpreted as protective figures within the Buddhist cosmology. Traditional festivals were given Buddhist meanings, and existing pilgrimage sites were incorporated into Buddhist sacred geography. The role of women in these early Buddhist communities reflects both the religion's innovative approaches to gender and the practical requirements of supporting international religious networks. Buddhist monasteries typically included separate facilities for nuns, who often served as teachers for women from merchant families and as maintainers of religious traditions within communities where men might be absent for extended periods due to trading activities. The biographical literature of early Central Asian Buddhism includes numerous accounts of women who played crucial roles in supporting translation projects, endowing religious institutions, and maintaining doctrinal purity during periods of political upheaval. The impact of these early Buddhist expansions extended far beyond the establishment of religious institutions to influence art, literature, philosophy, and daily life throughout Central Asia. Local literary traditions began incorporating Buddhist themes and narrative techniques, while legal systems adapted Buddhist ethical principles to supplement traditional approaches to conflict resolution. Medical practices combined traditional healing methods with Buddhist understandings of the relationship between physical and spiritual well-being, and educational systems began including Buddhist philosophical training alongside practical instruction in commerce and crafts. The infrastructure of pilgrimage that developed during this period created the first systematic networks for long-distance religious travel in human history. Pilgrimage routes that connected major Buddhist sites in India with emerging centers in Central Asia required extensive planning and coordination, establishment of rest stops and supply depots, development of guide services and security arrangements, creation of financial instruments that could support travel lasting months or years, and diplomatic negotiations that enabled pilgrims to cross political boundaries safely. By the time Buddhism began its systematic penetration into China during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the religion had already been transformed through its Central Asian experiences into something significantly different from its original Indian form. The emphasis on universal compassion had been strengthened through encounter with diverse populations. The philosophical sophistication had been enhanced through dialogue with Greek and Iranian intellectual traditions, and the practical organization had been adapted to serve the needs of international communities rather than local populations alone. This transformed Buddhism, enriched by centuries of cross-cultural encounter, would prove far more successful in Chinese soil than the original Indian version might have been. The Great Pilgrimages. The morning when Xuanzang stepped beyond the last Chinese frontier post at Yumen, where the Great Wall makes its final gesture toward controlling the vastness beyond, marked more than the beginning of an individual journey toward spiritual fulfillment. His solitary figure disappearing into the Taklamakan desert, carrying little more than determination and faith to sustain him across thousands of miles of dangerous terrain, represented the culmination of Buddhist pilgrimage that had been building for over 2 centuries. Behind him lay the relative security of Tang China, where Buddhism had found imperial patronage and scholarly recognition. Ahead lay the unknown expanses of Central Asia and the distant goal of India, where the historical Buddha had walked and taught, where the original texts preserved the authentic teachings that Chinese translations had sometimes rendered imperfectly or incompletely. The tradition that inspired Xuanzang's extraordinary journey had been established 2 centuries earlier by Faxian, whose own pilgrimage between 399 and 414 CE created the template for subsequent Buddhist travel to India. Faxian's account of his experiences, preserved in his Record of Buddhistic Kingdoms, reveals both the immense difficulties faced by early pilgrims and the profound spiritual transformation that such journeys could produce. Traveling at a time when political instability made the Silk Road routes even more dangerous than usual, when bandits controlled many of the oasis cities and local rulers changed allegiances with bewildering frequency, Faxian demonstrated that individual determination could overcome obstacles that would have stopped less motivated travelers. The challenges that confronted these early Buddhist pilgrims extended far beyond the physical hardships of desert crossing and mountain passage. Each major cultural boundary they crossed required adaptation to different languages, different customs, different political systems, and different forms of Buddhist practice. The Buddhism they encountered in Central Asian oasis cities had been transformed through centuries of cultural synthesis, while the Buddhism they would find in India retained characteristics that had been modified or lost during transmission to China. These pilgrims served as bridges between different branches of their faith, carrying innovations and insights in both directions while developing synthetic understanding through exposure to the religion's full diversity. Faxian's first major stop outside China, in the oasis kingdom of Shanshan, provided him with an early glimpse of how Buddhism could flourish in multicultural environments. The monastery where he received hospitality housed monks from at least 6 different countries, each maintaining their particular traditions of monastic discipline while participating in shared religious activities. The morning prayers combined Sanskrit chants learned from Indian teachers with Sogdian translations that served the practical needs of international commerce, and Chinese adaptations that reflected Confucian concepts of social harmony. This linguistic symphony demonstrated how Buddhist practice could preserve essential unity while accommodating enormous diversity in expression. The library attached to the Shanshan monastery contained texts that revealed the complex pathways by which Buddhist literature had spread throughout Central Asia. Palm leaf manuscripts from Ceylon preserved some of the oldest recorded versions of the Buddha's discourses. Chinese translations showed how Buddhist concepts had been adapted to East Asian philosophical frameworks. Sogdian versions demonstrated how the religion had been made accessible to Central Asian merchant communities, and Sanskrit commentaries revealed the ongoing development of Buddhist philosophy in the Indian centers, where the tradition continued to evolve. For a scholar like Faxian, whose pilgrimage was motivated partly by concerns about textual accuracy, this diversity posed both opportunities and challenges. The route that carried Faxian from Shanshan toward India, following caravan tracks that skirted the northern edge of the Taklamakan Desert before turning south through the Karakoram passes, brought him into contact with Buddhist communities that had developed their own distinctive approaches to religious practice. In Kucha, where the great translator Kumarajiva had been born and educated, Faxian encountered a form of Buddhism that emphasized the Sarvastivada school's systematic approach to philosophical analysis. The debates he witnessed in Kucha's monasteries, conducted in a mixture of Sanskrit and local languages, with translations provided for visitors from distant regions, demonstrated the intellectual sophistication that Buddhism could achieve when supported by stable political conditions and adequate economic resources. The artistic traditions that Faxian encountered in these Central Asian Buddhist centers reflected the same synthetic approach that characterized their textual and philosophical developments. The monastery walls in Kucha displayed frescoes that combined Indian iconographic conventions with Persian decorative techniques and local artistic sensibilities, creating visual narratives that could communicate Buddhist teachings to audiences regardless of their linguistic backgrounds. The Buddha images carved in local stone employed Greek sculptural techniques learned from artistic traditions that traced back to Alexander's conquests, while their spiritual expressions drew from Indian contemplative traditions that emphasized inner transformation over external appearance. The economic arrangements that supported these Central Asian Buddhist communities revealed sophisticated understanding of how religious institutions could serve commercial networks while maintaining their spiritual integrity. Monasteries located at strategic points along major trade routes provided essential services to traveling merchants, secure accommodation, reliable information about route conditions, and banking services that enabled the transfer of funds across vast distances. In return, these merchant communities provided the economic foundation that enabled monasteries to support large populations of monks, maintain extensive libraries, and sponsor the translation projects that kept Buddhist learning alive and growing. The seasonal rhythms that governed life in these oasis communities influenced the patterns of Buddhist practice and scholarly activity. During the winter months, when mountain passes became impassable and caravan traffic slowed to a trickle, monasteries became centers of intensive study and translation work. Scholars who had gathered from across the Buddhist world during the traveling season could devote themselves to collaborative projects without the interruptions that characterized busier periods. The great translation workshops that produced some of the most influential versions of Buddhist texts typically operated during these quiet months, when international teams of linguists and philosophers could work together without distraction. The approach to Bamian, where Faxian encountered the colossal Buddha statues that would later inspire Xuanzang's detailed descriptions, provided both pilgrims with their most powerful experience of how Buddhist vision could transform physical landscapes. The decision to carve monumental figures directly into the cliff face, rather than constructing separate buildings that might be destroyed by military conflict or natural disasters, reflected sophisticated understanding of how religious art could achieve permanence in politically unstable regions. The surrounding caves that housed monks and stored texts demonstrated similar adaptation to local conditions, while maintaining the essential functions that Buddhist monastic life required. The scholarly activities that Faxian and later Xuanzang pursued at Nalanda University in India represented the culmination of their pilgrimage experiences. This institution, which by the 7th century housed over 10,000 scholars and students from across the Buddhist world, provided the closest approximation to a modern university that existed anywhere in the medieval world. The curriculum combined rigorous study of Buddhist texts and philosophy with training in languages, logic, medicine, and other practical subjects necessary for educated participation in international scholarly communities. Xuanzang's years at Nalanda, where he studied under Silabhadra and other masters who were recognized as the most accomplished Buddhist scholars of their generation, provided him with far more than academic credentials. The debates he participated in, the texts he helped translate, and the friendships he formed with scholars from across Asia created networks of intellectual exchange that would influence Buddhist development for centuries after his return to China. His systematic copying of Sanskrit texts and his detailed notes on philosophical questions that had never been adequately addressed in Chinese Buddhist literature transformed him from a pilgrim seeking personal enlightenment into a scholar whose work would shape his tradition's future development. The return journeys of these great pilgrims, carrying precious texts and memories of transformative experiences back to their home communities, completed circuits of exchange that enriched Buddhist understanding throughout the regions they touched. The translations that Xuanzang produced during the remainder of his life after returning to China, working with teams of scholars who helped render Sanskrit concepts into sophisticated Chinese philosophical vocabulary, established new standards for accuracy and completeness that influenced all subsequent Chinese Buddhist literature. The travel accounts that both Foxian and Xuanzang wrote provided practical information for future pilgrims, while preserving detailed records of Buddhist communities that would later disappear during periods of political upheaval. The influence of these pilgrimage traditions extended far beyond the Buddhist community to affect literature, geography, and international relations throughout Asia. The detailed descriptions that pilgrims provided of foreign lands and customs became source material for poets, historians, and political advisors. The diplomatic relationships that pilgrims established, carrying greetings between rulers separated by vast distances and serving as informal ambassadors for their home regions, contributed to the maintenance of peaceful relationships that benefited commercial as well as religious exchange. The geographic knowledge that accumulated through centuries of pilgrimage travel provided foundations for the map-making and route-finding expertise that supported the expansion of trade networks throughout the Silk Road world. The legendary transformations of these historical pilgrimages, particularly the evolution of Xuanzang's journey into the fantastical narrative of Journey to the West, demonstrate how religious travel could capture popular imagination while preserving essential spiritual insights through entertaining stories. The Monkey King and Pig Companion who accompany the fictional version of Xuanzang, along with the various demons and obstacles they encounter, represent psychological and spiritual challenges that any serious religious practitioner must face, while the ultimate success of their mission affirms the possibility of spiritual achievement through persistence and proper guidance. The Light from the West. On a spring morning in the 9th year of Emperor Taizong's reign, when the air in Chang'an carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry trees and the sound of market bells announcing another day of prosperity in the greatest city on earth, a small procession approached the western gates of the imperial palace. At its head walked a figure whose appearance immediately marked him as a traveler from distant lands, his beard trimmed in the Persian fashion, his robes cut in the Syrian style, his complexion bearing the bronze of desert crossings, and his eyes holding the depth that comes from having seen horizons that stretch beyond the edges of familiar maps. This was Alopen, whose Syriac name meant teacher, and whose presence in the Tang capital represented the culmination of a journey that had carried him across the breadth of the civilized world. Behind him walked a small group of companions whose diverse origins told the story of Christianity's eastward expansion, Persian priests whose ancestors had preserved the faith through centuries of Sasanian rule, Sogdian merchants whose commercial networks had carried religious ideas along with trade goods, and Syrian monks whose monastery scriptoriums had produced the texts that now traveled in carefully wrapped bundles carried by the pack animals that brought up the rear of this modest caravan. The Emperor Taizong, who received Alopen's embassy that day, in a throne room whose silk hangings displayed patterns that spoke of cultural connections reaching to the farthest corners of his empire, was himself the embodiment of the cosmopolitan spirit that characterized the Tang dynasty at its height. His court included advisors from Korea and Japan, administrators whose families had migrated from Central Asia, military commanders whose service had earned them Chinese citizenship regardless of their ethnic origins, and scholars whose knowledge encompassed the intellectual traditions of multiple civilizations. In this environment, a delegation representing yet another foreign wisdom tradition would be received with the curiosity and respect that the Tang accorded to all forms of genuine learning. The texts that Alopen presented to the emperor, carefully translated into Chinese by scholarly teams that had worked for months to render Christian concepts into language that would be comprehensible to Chinese philosophical thought, represented more than simple religious propaganda. These early Christian writings, adapted to Chinese cultural context, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how spiritual truth could be expressed through different cultural frameworks while maintaining its essential character. The opening passages of what would later be called the Jesus Sutras, describing Christ's teachings in language that echoed both Buddhist and Confucian terminology, created bridges between Christian insight and existing Chinese wisdom traditions. The decision that Emperor Taizong announced after studying these texts and hearing Alopen's explanations, proclaiming that, quote, "This teaching is helpful to all creatures and beneficial to mankind. Let it be preached freely in our empire," reflected the pragmatic tolerance that had enabled the Tang dynasty to govern successfully the most diverse population ever unified under single political authority. Rather than viewing Christianity as a threat to Chinese cultural integrity, the emperor recognized it as another source of ethical guidance that could contribute to the moral foundation necessary for good government. The monastery that was subsequently built for Alopen and his companions in Chang'an's foreign quarter, with imperial funds and according to architectural plans that blended Syrian ecclesiastical design with Chinese building techniques, became the first in a network of Christian institutions that would eventually extend throughout the Tang Empire. The Nestorian stele, erected in 781 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Christianity's official recognition in China, provides detailed information about the expansion of this network and the adaptation of Christian practice to Chinese cultural requirements. The inscription on the stele, composed by the priest Adam, whose Chinese name was Jingjing, and executed by court calligrapher Lu Shuyan, represents one of the most sophisticated examples of cross-cultural religious communication in human history. Written in both Chinese and Syriac scripts, the text demonstrates how Christian theology could be expressed through Chinese philosophical concepts while maintaining doctrinal authenticity. The description of the Trinity using Taoist terminology for the relationship between heaven, earth, and humanity. The explanation of Christ's salvific mission through Buddhist concepts of compassion and skillful means, and the adaptation of Christian ethical teachings to Confucian principles of social harmony, all demonstrate remarkable theological creativity, guided by genuine respect for both traditions. The Christian communities that developed throughout Tang China during the 7th and 8th centuries represented unprecedented experiments in religious enculturation. Unlike the Christian expansion in the Mediterranean world, which had occurred primarily within Greco-Roman cultural framework, or the later European missionary activities that often demanded complete cultural transformation from their converts. Nestorian Christianity in China developed forms of practice and belief that preserved essential Christian insights, while allowing converts to maintain their Chinese cultural identity. The artistic traditions that emerged from these Chinese Christian communities reflect the same synthetic approach that characterized their theological developments. The silk paintings and bronze artifacts that have been discovered in archaeological excavations, particularly those found at Dunhuang, display Christian iconography executed according to Chinese artistic conventions. Images of Christ and the Apostles rendered in the style of Chinese court portraiture, angels depicted with the flowing robes and graceful gestures characteristic of Tang Dynasty art, and biblical narratives illustrated using landscape techniques derived from Chinese painting traditions, all demonstrate how Christian visual culture could adapt to local aesthetic preferences while maintaining religious authenticity. The translation projects that occupied Christian scholars throughout this period, working to render Syriac liturgical texts and theological treatises into Chinese, while adapting biblical narratives to Chinese literary conventions, created new forms of religious literature that influenced both communities. Chinese Christian texts employed poetic techniques derived from Tang literary tradition to express theological concepts, while Chinese Buddhist and Confucian writers began incorporating elements from Christian thought that enriched their own philosophical vocabularies. The cross-fertilization that resulted from these translation activities demonstrates how religious encounter could enhance rather than threaten existing wisdom traditions. The economic foundation that supported these Christian communities reveals the sophisticated commercial networks that connected Nestorian Christians across the breadth of Asia. Syrian merchants who had established trading relationships with Chinese partners often endowed churches and monasteries as expressions of gratitude for commercial success, while providing spiritual centers for Christian traders, who might spend months or years away from their home communities. The banking services that these religious institutions provided, enabling the transfer of funds between distant cities through letters of credit guaranteed by church authorities, created economic relationships that transcended political boundaries. The role of women in these Chinese Christian communities reflects both Nestorian theological emphasis on gender equality and adaptation to Chinese social expectations. Christian women often served as teachers and community leaders while maintaining the social roles that Chinese culture expected of respectable women. The biographical literature that survives from this period includes accounts of Christian women who played crucial roles in supporting translation projects, managing community finances, and maintaining religious traditions during periods when male clergy might be absent due to missionary travel or political upheaval. The seasonal festivals that Chinese Christians developed demonstrate how religious celebration could blend Christian liturgical requirements with Chinese cultural traditions. Christmas celebrations incorporated elements from Chinese New Year festivities. Easter observances adapted techniques from Chinese spring festivals that celebrated renewal and rebirth. And saints' days were coordinated with the Chinese calendar system that governed agricultural and commercial activities. These hybrid celebrations enabled Chinese Christians to participate fully in their society's cultural life, while maintaining their distinctive religious identity. The educational institutions that Christian communities established throughout Tang China provided services that extended far beyond religious instruction. Christian schools often served as centers for language education, where Chinese students could learn Syriac and Persian, while foreign residents acquired Chinese literacy. The medical knowledge that Christian monasteries preserved, combining Syrian healing traditions with Chinese pharmaceutical expertise, made these institutions valuable resources for their surrounding communities regardless of religious affiliation. The diplomatic role that Chinese Christians occasionally played, serving as intermediaries between the Tang court and foreign rulers who shared their religious affiliation, demonstrates how religious networks could facilitate political relationships. Christian merchants and clergy who traveled regularly between China and the Middle East often carried diplomatic messages and commercial information that benefited political as well as religious cooperation. The account of the Nestorian monk Rabban Bar Sama's journey from Beijing to Europe in the late 13th century, where he served as an unofficial ambassador while conducting his religious pilgrimage, illustrates how individual Christians could serve as bridges between distant political systems. The artistic innovations that characterized Chinese Christian communities influenced broader artistic development throughout East Asia. Christian techniques for depicting spiritual concepts visually, particularly methods for representing divine authority and spiritual transformation, were adapted by Buddhist and Taoist artists who found these approaches useful for their own religious purposes. The architectural elements that Chinese Christians developed for their places of worship, combining Syrian ecclesiastical requirements with Chinese building techniques and aesthetic preferences, influenced the design of religious buildings throughout the region. The decline of Chinese Christianity during the late Tang period, culminating in the persecution of foreign religions during the 840s, reflects changing political circumstances rather than inherent problems with Christian adaptation to Chinese culture. The anti-Buddhist edicts that Emperor Wuzong issued during his campaign to restore what he considered authentic Chinese values affected Christian communities, primarily because they were classified with Buddhism as foreign religions, rather than because of specifically anti-Christian sentiment. The burial of the Nestorian stele during this period, probably to protect it from destruction, demonstrates how Chinese Christians sought to preserve their heritage while adapting to changing political conditions. The legacy of this early Chinese Christian experiment extends far beyond its immediate historical significance, to demonstrate possibilities for cross-cultural religious encounter that remain relevant for contemporary global civilization. The theological creativity that enabled Nestorian Christians to express their faith through Chinese philosophical concepts, the artistic synthesis that produced new forms of religious expression, and the social integration that allowed foreign religious communities to contribute to Chinese cultural life, all provide models for how religious diversity can enrich rather than threaten civilizational development. The eternal flames. In the pre-dawn darkness that settles over the high plateau of Takhti Suleiman, where the ruins of ancient Adur-Gushnasp rise from an extinct volcanic crater like the memory of divine fire made manifest in stone, the eternal flame that once burned at the heart of the Sasanian Empire continues its vigil in the imagination of those who understand that some lights can never truly be extinguished. Here, 2,000 meters above sea level in the mountains of Azerbaijan, where thermal springs bubble with water heated by the Earth's core, and calcified deposits create landscapes that seem touched by otherworldly forces. The most sacred of Zoroastrianism's three great fires once drew pilgrims from across the Persian Empire and beyond. The morning when Khosrow II made his pilgrimage to this sacred site, traveling from his capital at Ctesiphon with a retinue that included courtiers from across the known world, and bearing gifts that represented the wealth of nations, marked more than a simple royal religious observance. His procession, winding up the mountain paths, past mineral springs whose vapors seemed to carry the breath of Ahura Mazda himself, represented the culmination of a religious tradition that had provided spiritual foundation for the greatest empires of the ancient Middle East for over a millennium. Behind him rode nobles whose families had served Zoroastrian kings since the time of Cyrus the Great, administrators whose bureaucratic systems had been shaped by Zoroastrian concepts of truth and righteousness, and priests whose knowledge preserved rituals that connected their generation with the first followers of Zoroaster's revolutionary teachings. The fire temple that awaited the royal party at the summit, its domed chamber housing flames that had burned continuously for centuries without ever being allowed to die, represented architectural and spiritual achievements that had influenced religious building throughout the ancient world. The careful engineering required to maintain perpetual combustion, the sophisticated ventilation systems that provided oxygen while protecting the sacred fire from wind and weather, and the symbolic arrangement that placed the flame at the center of carefully calculated proportions, all demonstrated how Zoroastrian understanding of cosmic order could be expressed through physical design that served both practical and spiritual purposes. The Adir-Gushnasp fire itself, one of the three flames that Zoroastrian tradition claimed had been kindled directly by Ahura Mazda at the beginning of time, represented more than religious symbolism to the worshippers who gathered in its presence. For Persian nobles who would soon ride into battle against Roman legions, the fire embodied the divine force that would guide their efforts and ensure victory for the righteous. For merchants whose trade networks extended from China to Constantinople, the flame symbolized the cosmic principles of truth and justice that governed honest commerce and fair dealing. For farmers whose irrigation systems channeled precious water across arid landscapes, the fire represented the light that makes all growth possible, and the warmth that sustains life through winter's darkness. The rituals that surrounded the maintenance of these sacred fires reveal the sophisticated theological understanding that Zoroastrianism had developed during its centuries of growth and refinement. The daily offerings of sandalwood and frankincense, materials whose procurement required commercial networks spanning continents, connected local religious observance with the global economy that Persian political power had helped create and protect. The prayers recited by specially trained priests, whose education included not only religious instruction but also training in astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy, combined spiritual devotion with intellectual sophistication that rivaled the achievements of any contemporary civilization. The 16 different types of fire that were combined to create each great fire, gathered from sources that included royal hearths, shepherds' fires, metalworkers' forges, and bakers' ovens, represented Zoroastrian recognition that divine force manifests itself through all legitimate human activities. The elaborate process required to combine these fires into the single sacred flame that would burn in the temple's central altar, involving months of careful collection, purification, and ceremonial combination, created a focus that literally embodied the unity of the entire Zoroastrian community. Each flame contributed to the great fire, carried with it the prayers and devotion of the people whose daily work had kindled it, while the resulting sacred fire became a symbol of how individual efforts could be unified into something greater than the sum of their parts. The influence of Zoroastrian fire temples extended far beyond the borders of the Persian Empire to shape religious architecture and practice throughout the regions touched by Persian cultural expansion. In the oasis cities of Central Asia, where Sogdian merchants maintained trading posts that served the commerce flowing between East and West, Zoroastrian temples provided both spiritual centers for Persian communities and examples of religious architecture that influenced local building traditions. The distinctive domed chambers that housed sacred fires, with their sophisticated ventilation systems and symbolic proportions, inspired temple designs that served other religious traditions while adapting Persian architectural innovations to local materials and climate conditions. The Zoroastrian communities that established themselves in the Great Silk Road cities created networks of religious and commercial cooperation that stretched across continents. In Bukhara, where the famous Temple of the Moon complemented Zoroastrian fire temples in serving the spiritual needs of a diverse population, Persian merchants and priests maintained connections with their home communities while adapting their religious practices to Central Asian conditions. The celebration of Nowruz, the Persian New Year that predated Zoroaster but had been incorporated into Zoroastrian religious calendar, became a major festival that brought together worshippers from multiple traditions, in celebrations that emphasized renewal, hope, and the triumph of light over darkness. The theological innovations that emerged from Zoroastrian encounters with other religious traditions demonstrate how religious exchange could enrich, rather than threaten existing belief systems. Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic dualism, the eternal struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, that would ultimately result in the triumph of good over evil, influenced Buddhist understanding of the relationship between enlightenment and ignorance, while contributing to Christian theological development regarding the nature of divine providence and human freedom. The Zoroastrian emphasis on individual moral responsibility, the belief that each person's choices contribute to the cosmic battle between light and darkness, resonated with religious traditions throughout the ancient world, while maintaining its distinctive Persian character. The calendar systems that Zoroastrian priests developed, combining astronomical observation with religious requirements and practical agricultural needs, influenced timekeeping throughout the ancient Middle East and Central Asia. The accurate calculation of seasonal changes that Zoroastrian festivals required, particularly the precise determination of the spring equinox that marked Nowruz, demonstrated mathematical and observational skills that made Zoroastrian priests valuable advisors to rulers, regardless of their personal religious affiliations. The diplomatic missions that often included Zoroastrian scholars, whose knowledge of multiple calendar systems enabled them to coordinate activities between different political entities, helped maintain the commercial relationships that supported Silk Road prosperity. The medical traditions that developed within Zoroastrian communities, combining Persian pharmaceutical knowledge with healing practices learned through contact with Indian, Chinese, and Greek medical systems, created therapeutic approaches that served diverse populations throughout the ancient world. Zoroastrian emphasis on the relationship between spiritual purity and physical health, reflected in elaborate purification rituals that used water, fire, and earth to cleanse both body and soul, influenced medical practice throughout the regions where Persian cultural influence was strong. The hospitals that Zoroastrian communities established, often associated with fire temples and staffed by priests who combined religious and medical training, provided healing services that benefited entire urban populations regardless of religious affiliation. The decline of Zoroastrianism as a major political force, beginning with the Arab conquest of the Sasanian Empire in 651 CE, marked the end of state-sponsored Zoroastrian expansion, but not the disappearance of Zoroastrian influence on Silk Road civilization. The Zoroastrian communities that survived under Islamic rule, particularly those in Central Asian cities where religious diversity had long been tolerated, continued to maintain their religious traditions while adapting to changed political circumstances. The fire temples that were not destroyed during the early Islamic conquests, particularly those in remote areas where conversion pressure was less intense, preserved Zoroastrian ritual knowledge and theological understanding through centuries of minority status. The migration of Zoroastrian refugees to India, beginning in the 8th century and continuing for several centuries thereafter, created the Parsi communities that would preserve Persian religious traditions while adapting them to South Asian cultural conditions. The ships that carried these religious exiles from Persian ports to Gujarat, loaded with sacred fires carefully maintained during the sea voyage and precious texts that preserved centuries of theological development, represented one of history's most successful religious preservation efforts. The communities that these refugees established in India, while adapting to Hindu cultural dominance and British colonial rule, maintained Zoroastrian religious practices with remarkable fidelity, while contributing significantly to Indian commercial and intellectual development. The archaeological evidence that continues to emerge from excavations throughout the former Persian Empire reveals the extent of Zoroastrian cultural influence and the sophistication of Zoroastrian religious institutions. The fire temple remains discovered at sites from Azerbaijan to Afghanistan, with their characteristic architectural features and evidence of elaborate ritual activities, demonstrate how widely Zoroastrian religious practices had spread throughout Central Asia. The coins, seals and artistic objects that bear Zoroastrian religious symbols, found in archaeological contexts from the Mediterranean to China, provide evidence of commercial and cultural networks that carried Persian religious ideas far beyond the boundaries of direct Persian political control. The intellectual legacy of Zoroastrianism, preserved in texts that survived the Islamic conquest and in theological concepts that influenced subsequent religious development, continues to provide insights into one of humanity's earliest experiments in monotheistic religion. Zoroastrian emphasis on ethical dualism, the belief that cosmic good and evil represent real forces that require human choice and action rather than abstract philosophical categories, influenced religious thinking throughout the ancient world, while anticipating theological developments that would not occur in other traditions for centuries. The Zoroastrian concept of divine judgment based on individual moral choices, combined with belief in resurrection and eternal reward or punishment, provided models for eschatological thinking that influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Zoroastrian understanding of religious tolerance reflected in Persian imperial policies that allowed subject peoples to maintain their traditional religious practices while requiring only political loyalty to the Persian state, created precedents for multicultural governance that influenced political development throughout the ancient world. The religious freedom that Persian rulers typically granted to their diverse subjects, combined with active patronage of local religious institutions and respect for existing sacred sites, demonstrated how imperial power could be exercised without requiring cultural uniformity from subject populations. The final synthesis. In the gentle light of a Baghdad morning in the early 9th century, when the muezzin's call to prayer echoes across a city that has become the crossroads of the civilized world, an extraordinary gathering takes place in the House of Wisdom that illustrates how religious diversity can become a source of intellectual strength rather than social division. Around a low table covered with manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Greek, and Syriac scripts, scholars whose personal faith journeys have carried them through multiple religious traditions work together on translation projects that will preserve and transmit humanity's accumulated spiritual wisdom to future generations. Among them sits Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the Nestorian Christian whose mastery of Greek medical texts makes him invaluable to the Abbasid caliphs' project of preserving and expanding human knowledge. His careful annotations in the margins of Galen's anatomical treatises, written in Syriac script but incorporating Arabic technical vocabulary and Persian pharmaceutical knowledge, represent the kind of intellectual synthesis that has made Baghdad the wonder of the medieval world. Beside him works Thabit ibn Qurra, the Sabian scholar from Haran, whose religious tradition preserves ancient Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge while embracing philosophical insights derived from Greek, Indian, and Islamic sources. The conversation that flows between these scholars, switching effortlessly between Arabic philosophical terminology and Persian mystical concepts, Sanskrit grammatical analysis, and Greek logical methods, demonstrates how spiritual traditions that might appear incompatible to distant observers can find common ground when approached with genuine respect and intellectual curiosity. Their shared project, rendering Aristotle's metaphysical investigations into Arabic, while incorporating commentary that draws from Islamic theological insight, Christian contemplative experience, and Zoroastrian ethical understanding, creates new forms of philosophical discourse that transcend the limitations of any single tradition. The arrival of a messenger carrying letters from Samarkand, where Buddhist scholars at local monasteries have requested copies of medical texts being translated in Baghdad, reminds the assembled scholars that their work serves practical as well as theoretical purposes. The knowledge they preserve and transmit, whether Galen's anatomical observations or Ptolemy's astronomical calculations, Al-Khwarizmi's mathematical innovations, or Indian pharmaceutical discoveries, provides tools that enable physicians, astronomers, and other specialists throughout the civilized world to serve their communities more effectively, regardless of religious differences. The Islamic context that enables this remarkable intellectual collaboration reflects sophisticated understanding of how religious truth can be pursued through encounter with multiple wisdom traditions, rather than isolation within a single interpretive framework. The Quranic principle that there is no compulsion in religion, combined with Islamic recognition that Allah has sent prophets and revelations to all peoples, creates theological space for genuine dialogue with other traditions, while maintaining Islamic identity and commitment. The practical policies that Abbasid rulers implement, protecting Christian and Jewish communities while welcoming scholars from various backgrounds, demonstrate how political power can support, rather than threaten, intellectual and religious diversity. The Sufi mystical traditions that begin to flourish throughout the Islamic world during this period exemplify how Islamic spirituality can incorporate insights from other contemplative traditions, while maintaining its distinctive character. The meditation techniques that Sufi masters develop, often drawing from Buddhist contemplative methods encountered through Central Asian connections, create new approaches to spiritual realization that appeal to seekers from diverse religious backgrounds. The poetry that emerges from these mystical circles, using Persian literary forms to express Arabic theological concepts while incorporating imagery derived from Christian, Buddhist, and Zoroastrian symbolism, creates artistic languages that speak to universal human spiritual aspirations. The pilgrimage networks that connect Mecca with distant Muslim communities, extending from Spain to China and from Russia to East Africa, create international Islamic communities that parallel and often intersect with the commercial and cultural networks that had previously served other religious traditions. Muslim merchants who establish mosques and schools in Central Asian cities, often in neighborhoods that already house Buddhist monasteries, Nestorian churches, and Zoroastrian fire temples contribute to urban environments where religious diversity becomes a normal rather than exceptional condition. The architectural innovations that emerge from these multicultural Islamic communities reflect the same synthetic approach that characterizes their intellectual and spiritual development. The madrasas that Muslim rulers established throughout Central Asia, designed to provide both religious education and practical training for commercial and administrative careers, incorporate architectural elements derived from Buddhist monastic design, Persian palace construction, and local building traditions. The mosques that serve diverse urban populations, with their courtyards that can accommodate worshippers from different ethnic backgrounds, and their libraries that preserve texts in multiple languages and scripts, demonstrate how Islamic religious architecture can adapt to local conditions while maintaining essential liturgical requirements. The scientific and philosophical achievements that result from this Islamic synthesis, building upon Greek theoretical foundations while incorporating insights from Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy, and Chinese technological innovation, create new forms of knowledge that influence intellectual development throughout the medieval world. The astronomical observatories that Muslim rulers establish, staffed by scholars whose training combines Islamic religious education with technical expertise derived from multiple cultural sources, produce observations and calculations that advance understanding of celestial mechanics, while serving the practical needs of navigation, calendar making, and agricultural planning. The commercial networks that support and benefit from this Islamic cultural expansion, connecting Muslim merchants with trading partners from multiple religious backgrounds while maintaining the ethical standards that Islamic law requires, demonstrate how religious principle can enhance rather than restrict international commerce. The banking innovations that Muslim financiers develop, creating credit instruments that enable commercial relationships based on trust rather than political or religious affiliation, provide economic foundations for cultural exchange that transcends religious boundaries. The educational institutions that Islamic communities establish throughout Central Asia, from Bukhara to Kashgar, and from Merv to Balkh, create opportunities for intellectual encounter between Islamic scholarship and other wisdom traditions. The libraries attached to major mosques and madrasas, containing texts in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and local languages alongside translations from Sanskrit, Chinese, and other source languages, preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost during periods of political upheaval, while making it available to scholars regardless of religious background. The diplomatic relationships that Islamic rulers maintain with non-Muslim powers, from Byzantine emperors to Chinese emperors and from Indian rajas to African kings, create channels for political and cultural communication that benefit all participants. The embassies that carry gifts and messages between distant courts, often including scholars who can serve as interpreters of different cultural traditions, maintain peaceful relationships that enable commercial and intellectual exchange to flourish. The artistic traditions that develop within these multicultural Islamic societies, combining Arabic calligraphy with Persian miniature painting, Turkish architectural techniques with Indian decorative arts, and local craft traditions with Islamic aesthetic principles, create new forms of artistic expression that influence cultural development throughout the medieval world. The manuscripts produced in Islamic scriptoriums, with their sophisticated integration of text and image, their adaptation of artistic techniques from multiple traditions, and their preservation of knowledge from various sources, represent achievements in book production that would not be matched in other parts of the world for centuries. The medical traditions that flourish in Islamic hospitals and schools, building upon Greek theoretical knowledge while incorporating practical insights from Indian, Persian, Chinese, and local healing systems, create therapeutic approaches that serve diverse populations while advancing understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and clinical practice. The hospitals that Muslim communities establish, often staffed by physicians trained in multiple medical traditions and serving patients regardless of religious affiliation, demonstrate how Islamic social organization can address practical human needs while maintaining religious integrity. The legal systems that Islamic scholars develop, adapting Quranic principles and prophetic precedents to local conditions while incorporating useful elements from existing legal traditions, create frameworks for social organization that can accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining Islamic identity. The commercial law that emerges from this synthesis, enabling Muslim merchants to conduct business with partners from different religious and cultural backgrounds, while observing Islamic ethical requirements, provides models for international commerce that influence business practices throughout the medieval world. The gradual process by which local populations throughout Central Asia adopt Islamic practice, typically extending over several generations and involving complex negotiations between Islamic requirements and existing cultural traditions, demonstrates how spiritual conversion can occur through persuasion and example, rather than coercion or conquest. The Sufi missionaries who play crucial roles in this process, often establishing communities that blend Islamic mystical practice with local spiritual traditions, while maintaining connection to broader Islamic networks, create forms of religious life that appeal to diverse populations while preserving essential Islamic commitments. The seasonal festivals and life cycle ceremonies that Muslim communities develop, adapting Islamic liturgical requirements to local cultural expectations, while creating new traditions that serve religiously diverse populations, demonstrate how religious practice can evolve to meet changing social needs without losing essential spiritual content. The marriage customs, funeral practices, and coming-of-age ceremonies that emerge from these adaptations, often incorporating elements from multiple religious traditions, while clearly maintaining Islamic identity, provide models for how religious communities can integrate into diverse social environments. Navigating time's currents, the eternal pilgrimage. As the last echoes of the call to prayer fade into the desert silence that surrounds the ruins of ancient Merv, where archaeologists carefully brush sand from foundation stones that once supported one of the greatest libraries in the medieval world. The profound legacy of religious exchange along the Silk Roads reveals itself not in any single surviving monument or preserved text, but in the transformed consciousness that continues to shape human approaches to the winds that sweep across these Central Asian steppes, carrying dust that may once have rested in the courtyards of Buddhist monasteries or the chambers of Zoroastrian fire temples. Whisper stories of how human beings learn to see the sacred through multiple lenses, while recognizing the essential unity that connects all authentic spiritual seeking. In the manuscript collections of libraries from Beijing to Cordoba, where scholars still discover fragments of texts that preserve traces of religious synthesis that occurred centuries ago along trade routes that connected distant civilizations, the intellectual achievements of Silk Road religious encounter continue to influence contemporary understanding of how different faith traditions can enrich, rather than threaten each other. The Buddhist sutras rendered into Persian philosophical vocabulary, the Christian theological treatises adapted to Chinese cultural concepts, the Islamic commentaries that incorporate insights from Zoroastrian ethical teaching, and Hindu contemplative practice, all demonstrate possibilities for cross-cultural religious dialogue that remain relevant for addressing contemporary challenges in our increasingly interconnected world. The archaeological discoveries that emerge each year from excavation sites throughout Central Asia, revealing prayer halls where multiple religious communities shared sacred space, workshops where artisans from different traditions collaborated in creating objects of beauty and devotion, and residential quarters where families from various cultural backgrounds lived as neighbors while maintaining their distinctive religious practices, provide concrete evidence that religious diversity need not lead to conflict when social conditions encourage cooperation rather than competition. The genetic research that traces population movements throughout the Silk Road regions, revealing how extensively different ethnic groups intermixed through centuries of migration, trade, and intermarriage, demonstrates that the cultural and religious synthesis evident in Silk Road civilization reflected deep social integration rather than superficial commercial contact. The linguistic studies that document how religious terminology traveled between different language families, with Sanskrit Buddhist concepts influencing Arabic Islamic vocabulary, while Chinese philosophical terms enriched Persian mystical expression, show how spiritual insights can transcend the boundaries of particular cultural traditions while enriching the expression of universal human experiences. The architectural remains that dot the landscape from Turkey to Mongolia, where ruined churches display Buddhist decorative motifs, monastery foundations reveal Persian construction techniques, and mosque designs incorporate elements from multiple religious building traditions, demonstrate how sacred architecture can evolve through cross-cultural encounter while maintaining the essential functions that different religious communities require. These hybrid buildings speak to contemporary architects and urban planners who face similar challenges in creating spaces that can serve religiously diverse populations while respecting the particular requirements of different faith traditions. The festival traditions that persist in Central Asian communities, where Nowruz celebrations blend Zoroastrian fire rituals with Islamic prayers and Buddhist offerings, where harvest festivals incorporate elements from multiple religious calendars, and where life cycle ceremonies combine customs from various cultural sources, provide living examples of how religious practice can evolve through cultural encounter while maintaining spiritual authenticity. These contemporary practices offer insights for modern multicultural societies seeking to create shared civic traditions that honor religious diversity while building social cohesion. The mystical poetry that emerged from Silk Road religious synthesis, where Persian Sufi verses employ Buddhist concepts of impermanence, where Chinese Buddhist poetry incorporates Taoist imagery, and where Islamic mystical writing draws from Christian contemplative expression, created artistic languages that continue to inspire spiritual seekers across cultural and religious boundaries. The universal themes that these poets explored, the longing for divine union, the recognition of cosmic interconnectedness, and the celebration of spiritual transformation, speak to contemporary readers regardless of their particular religious affiliations, while demonstrating how authentic spirituality transcends cultural limitations. The educational models that Silk Road religious communities developed, combining rigorous study of particular religious traditions with respectful engagement with other wisdom systems, provide precedents for contemporary institutions seeking to prepare students for life in religiously diverse societies. The curriculum that institutions like Nalanda University offered, including Buddhist philosophy, alongside logic, medicine, astronomy, and language study, demonstrates how religious education can maintain scholarly rigor and spiritual depth while preparing students to engage constructively with diverse intellectual traditions. The diplomatic protocols that enabled peaceful relationships between religiously different political entities, based on pragmatic recognition that commercial prosperity and political stability benefit from religious tolerance rather than conflict, offer lessons for contemporary international relations. The treaty provisions that guaranteed religious freedom for merchant communities, the diplomatic immunities that protected religious pilgrims traveling through foreign territories, and the commercial agreements that enabled interfaith business partnerships, all demonstrate how political wisdom can create frameworks for peaceful coexistence, despite religious differences. The translation methodologies that Silk Road scholars developed, requiring deep understanding of both source and target cultures, while maintaining fidelity to essential spiritual content, provide models for contemporary interfaith dialogue and comparative religious study. The techniques that enabled Buddhist concepts to be expressed through Islamic philosophical vocabulary, Christian theology to be rendered in Chinese cultural terms, and Zoroastrian ethical teaching to be adapted to local moral frameworks, all demonstrate how religious truth can be shared across cultural boundaries without losing its transformative power. The commercial innovations that emerged from religiously diverse trading networks, including banking systems that functioned across religious boundaries, standardized weights and measures that facilitated interfaith commerce, and dispute resolution mechanisms that could handle conflicts between parties from different legal traditions, demonstrate how practical cooperation can transcend religious differences when economic incentives encourage collaboration rather than competition. The artistic techniques that developed through religious cross-fertilization, combining iconographic traditions from different spiritual systems while creating new forms of religious expression that spoke to diverse audiences, offer inspiration for contemporary artists and designers working in multicultural contexts. The architectural elements that enabled buildings to serve multiple religious functions, the decorative schemes that incorporated symbols from various traditions, and the artistic languages that could communicate spiritual concepts across cultural boundaries, all provide examples of how creativity can bridge religious differences while enriching artistic expression. The medical and healing traditions that resulted from religious synthesis, combining therapeutic approaches from different cultural systems while maintaining respect for various spiritual approaches to health and wellness, anticipate contemporary integrative medicine and holistic healthcare approaches. The hospital systems that serve diverse populations, the pharmaceutical knowledge that drew from multiple traditional medicine systems, and the healing practices that addressed both physical and spiritual dimensions of wellness, all demonstrate how religious wisdom can contribute to practical human welfare. The legal innovations that enabled diverse religious communities to coexist peacefully, creating frameworks for personal law that respected different religious requirements while maintaining common civic standards, provide precedents for contemporary multicultural legal systems. The commercial law that enabled interfaith business relationships, the family law that accommodated different marriage and inheritance customs, and the criminal law that could address conflicts between parties from different religious backgrounds, all demonstrate how legal systems can adapt to religious diversity while maintaining social order. As modern transportation and communication technologies create new forms of global interconnection that parallel and exceed the networks that connected Silk Road civilizations, the wisdom embedded in these ancient experiments in religious coexistence becomes increasingly relevant. The demonstration that different religious traditions can maintain their distinctive identities while learning from each other. That spiritual authenticity does not require cultural isolation, and that religious diversity can be a source of social strength rather than division. All provide hope and practical guidance for contemporary efforts to build peaceful and prosperous multicultural societies. In the quiet moments when contemporary pilgrims, whether they journey to Mecca or Jerusalem, to Bodh Gaya or Mount Kailash. Pause to reflect on the spiritual achievements of those who have traveled these paths before them. The legacy of Silk Road exchanges continues to inspire recognition that the human search for meaning takes many forms, while pointing toward universal truths that unite rather than divide. The roads that once carried silken spices between distant civilizations have become pathways of the spirit that continue to connect seekers across all boundaries of culture, language, and faith. The eternal flames that once burned in Zoroastrian temples, the Dharma wheels that turned in Buddhist monasteries, the crosses that marked Nestorian churches, and the crescents that crown Islamic mosques, all pointed toward the same fundamental recognition that the sacred dimension of existence calls human beings to live with compassion, wisdom, and reverence for the mystery that sustains all life. In learning to see this common calling through the diverse expressions that different cultures and religions have created, the travelers along the Silk Roads pioneered approaches to spiritual understanding that remain essential for humanity's continued journey toward greater wisdom, deeper compassion, and more inclusive recognition of the divine presence that manifests itself through all authentic seeking.